I made cookies. I made cookies special for today's stream. So we have them in, you know, the moon. I had some trouble shaping the moon, shaping the craters and everything. And I've made one that looks like an astronaut's helmet, and one that's shaped like the famous photo of Buzz Aldrin's boot print. They're beautiful cookies. Please compliment my cookies. Do it. I demand. I'll put them over on the counter. How about that? Yeah, on the edge of the sink. It's fine. They won't fall in. I suppose a brief introduction's in order, too, if you're new here. My name is Rin Zenith. I am a Space Elf VTuber. I live in my little shuttle, which is kind of like a camper. You know, since all my stuff is kind of automated, I haven't learned a whole lot of astronomy. So I've been doing these space streams to learn more about that along with all of you. But today we're going to be focusing on the moon landing because the anniversary of that was yesterday. So this article was actually posted 4 years ago on the 50th anniversary. So it was July 20th in 1969. One giant leap for mankind.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969.
So July 1969, it's a little over 8 years since the flights of Gagarin and Shepard, followed quickly by President Kennedy's challenge to put a man on the moon before the decade is out. It's only 7 months since NASA's made a bold decision to send Apollo 8 all the way to the moon on the first manned flight of the massive Saturn V rocket. I did once go to the Space Museum in Huntsville, Alabama, and I saw their massive model of the Saturn V rocket. The thing is huge. Oh my goodness. It was beautiful. Now, on the morning of July 16th, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins sit atop another Saturn V at Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. The three-stage, 363-foot rocket will use its 7.5 million pounds of thrust to propel them into space and into history. At 9:32 a.m. EDT, the engines fire and Apollo 11 clears the tower. About 12 minutes later, the crew is in Earth orbit. After 1.5 orbits, Apollo 11 gets a go for what mission controllers call translunar injection. In other words, it's time to head for the moon. 3 days later, the crew is in lunar orbit. A day after that, Armstrong and Aldrin climb into the lunar module Eagle and begin the descent, while Collins orbits in the command module Columbia. Collins later writes that Eagle is the weirdest looking contraption I have ever seen in the sky, but it will prove its worth. When it comes time to set Eagle down in the Sea of Tranquility, Armstrong improvises, manually piloting the ship past an area littered with boulders. During the final seconds of descent, Eagle's computer is sounding alarms. Turns out to be a simple case of the computer trying to do too many things at once, but as Aldrin will later point out, unfortunately, came up when we did not want to be trying to solve these particular problems. When the lunar module lands at 4:17 p.m. EDT, only 30 seconds of fuel remain. Oof. Armstrong radios Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. Mission control erupts in celebration as the tension breaks, and the controller tells the crew, "You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue or breathing again." Armstrong will later confirm that landing was his biggest concern, saying the unknowns were rampant, and there were just 1,000 things to worry about. Oh yeah. At 10:56 p.m. EDT, Armstrong is ready to plant the first human foot on another world. With more than 500 million people watching on television, he climbs down the ladder and proclaims, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I did bring this up. It is 3 hours long, so we're definitely not going to be watching the whole thing right now. But just to let you know, this is on YouTube, and this is on NASA's official YouTube channel. So if you want to watch the whole thing yourself, you definitely can. So Aldrin joins him shortly and offers a simple but powerful description of the lunar surface. Magnificent desolation. That's a great band name, by the way. I don't know if there somehow isn't a band with that name, but or a good song name at least. Is there a song like about the moon called Magnificent Desolation, because there should be. Oh, if I get a theme song for me, can it be called the Magnificent Desolation? They explore the surface for 2.5 hours, collecting samples and taking photographs. They leave behind an American flag, a patch honoring the fallen Apollo 1 crew, and a plaque on one of Eagle's legs. It reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind." Armstrong and Aldrin blast off and dock with Collins in Columbia. Collins later says that, for the first time, he really felt that we were going to carry this thing off. The crew splashes down off Hawaii on July 24th. Kennedy's challenge has been met. Men from Earth have walked on the moon and safely returned home. In an interview years later, Armstrong praises the hundreds of thousands of people behind the project. Every guy that's setting up the test, cranking the torque wrench, and so on is saying, man or woman, if anything goes wrong here, it's not going to be my fault. In a post-flight press conference, Armstrong calls the flight a beginning of a new age, while Collins talks about the future journeys to Mars. Over the next 3.5 years, 10 astronauts will follow in their footsteps. Gene Cernan, commander of the last Apollo mission, leaves the lunar surface with these words, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." People love conspiracy theories, so I want to go over quickly this little article here. How do we know that we went to the moon? Because we fucking went to the moon, okay? Every single argument claiming that NASA faked the moon landings has been discredited. But even today, 50 years later, people discuss conspiracy claims online, on television programs, and around the dinner table. Fun fact, or moon fact, with a powerful amateur telescope, you can see the Apollo landing sites, and if you look at the photos from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, you can spot the remnants of the Apollo missions yourself. If you find yourself in a debate questioning whether humankind first stepped on the moon on the 20th of July in 1969, the chances are that you were woefully underprepared. Most people take it as gospel that the US government, NASA, the 12 astronauts in total that have walked on the moon, and the 400,000 people involved in the Apollo program would have neither the will nor the way to fake one of humanity's greatest ever achievements. But there are those who think the landings were a hoax. They claim the US government faked the Apollo 11 and later missions, either to deal a crucial blow to the USSR in the space race, or to boost NASA funding, or to divert attention away from the Vietnam War. The argument for any of these viewpoints rests on finding evidence that the landings were faked. And more often than not, people point out peculiarities in specific images or videos to deal the critical blow. Someone uses these oddities as evidence. What do you say? Here are the most common arguments that support this view, and why each of them is wrong. Things left on the moon, reflectors installed on the surface, astronauts brought back lunar rocks. Their photographic evidence. One of the most popular conspiracy arguments that there are never any stars in the Apollo photos. Free from Earth-like pollution and hazy atmosphere, you would expect to see thousands of stars in all of the astronauts' images. Unfortunately, this argument rests on the photos being snapped during the lunar night. All manned missions to the moon took place in sunny daytime. This meant starlight lost the battle against every bright surface of the moon, too dim to show up in photos. Because the moon is super reflective, y'all. Another common argument is that the crosshairs that appear in many Apollo images sometimes appear to be behind objects in the photos. If the images were real, this would be impossible, suggesting someone painted them on. But testing here on Earth has showed that the brightly lit objects make the crosshairs appear fainter. When these images are copied or scanned, some of this detail is lost completely, giving the effect that the crosshair is behind the object in certain shots. Others point to an oddity in a photo of a moon rock taken during the Apollo 16 mission. There appears to be a C written on it, like a lettered movie prop. Again, analyzing the original photo, there is no anomaly, the C isn't there. Most likely it was a piece of hair or thread introduced during copying. A more subtle argument that the landings were faked is based on various misunderstandings of NASA equipment and lunar physics. A well-known example is that the American flag that Buzz Aldrin in space that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin placed on the moon. It appears to flutter in the wind in some photos. How could this happen when the moon has no wind? In fact, it isn't fluttering at all. A horizontal rod at the top of the pole holds the flag unfurled. This makes it look like the wind is stopping it from hanging down. And there is a fluttering effect because the weak gravity on the moon is not strong enough to uncrumple the flag. After a little waving while the astronauts planted the flags on the moon's surface, they have remained still ever since. Perhaps the most convincing argument that the landings were faked has to do with something called the Van Allen belts. These are two giant donut-shaped belts surrounding the Earth. They are made of highly energetic, charged particles from the solar wind. Some people believe humans couldn't have passed through these belts without being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. This was a genuine concern before the Apollo missions, and it is the reason scientists behind Apollo 11 made sure they protected the astronauts as best they could. They insulated the spacecraft from radiation with an aluminum shell, and they chose a trajectory from Earth to the Moon which minimized the amount of time spent in the Van Allen belts. Readings from the 9 Apollo missions that reached the Moon showed the astronauts average radiation exposure was 0.45 radiation rads. This proved NASA was right to shield the astronauts from radiation. Though it's less than that experienced by some nuclear energy workers, 0.46 rad is around 10 times more than the radiation exposure of medical professionals who routinely work with X-ray and radiotherapy machines. Oh my gosh. Proof we walked on the moon. Of course, until we return to the moon, there will always be anomalies and oddities in the records that can spark new claims that the moon landings were faked. It is the sheer size and variety of this record that proves every one of these claims to be false. From the Apollo moon missions, there are 8,400 publicly available photos, thousands of hours of video footage, a mountain of scientific data, and full transcripts and audio recordings of all air-to-ground conversations. We even have 382 kilograms of moon rock that Apollo astronauts brought back to Earth. These rocks have been independently verified as lunar by laboratories around the world, ruling out a US conspiracy. If this is not enough to convince the most hardened skeptic, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, might sway them. Today, LRO takes high-resolution pictures of the lunar surface from a low orbit. During its mission, it has captured the landing sites in the abandoned descent modules and rovers from the Apollo missions. And its resolution is so good, it has picked up the dark, squiggly paths that the astronauts' footprints made. Spacecraft from China, India, and Japan have also spotted these landing sites, providing further independent verification of the landings. Final nail in the coffin of the moon hoax theories is that a simple instrument installed 50 years ago by Apollo 11. During their day on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin planted a lunar laser ranging retroflector array on the surface. Still operational today, and it allows us to reflect lasers off of it and measure the distance to the moon down to the centimeter. We simply couldn't do this if we hadn't visited the moon. So there we go. Got that out of the way. Look at him. Jelly donut. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced before a special joint session of Congress the dramatic and ambitious goal of sending an American safely to the moon before the end of the decade. Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States catch up to and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space on April 12, 1961, greatly embarrassing the United States. While Alan Shepard became the first American in space on May 5th, he only flew on a short suborbital flight instead of orbiting the Earth as Gagarin had done. Kennedy wanted to announce a program that the U.S. had a strong chance at achieving before the Soviet Union. After consulting with Vice President Johnson, NASA Administrator James Webb, piece of shit, excuse me, and other officials, he concluded that landing an American on the moon would be a very challenging technological feat, but an area of space exploration in which the US actually had a potential lead. There was no known way to the moon. NASA had to learn everything about it. As Robert Gilruth, head of the Space Task Group and later NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, wrote an Apollo Expeditions to the Moon. Flying man to the moon required an enormous advance in the science of flight in a very short time. Rendezvous, docking, prolonged weightlessness, radiation, and the meteoroid hazard all involved problems of unknown dimensions. We would need giant new rockets burning high-energy hydrogen, a breakthrough in reliability, new methods of staging and handling, and the ability to launch on time, since going to the moon required the accurate hitting of launch windows. Man himself was a great unknown. At the time of the president's decision, we had only Alan Shepard's brief 15 minutes of flight on which to base our knowledge. Could man really function on a 2-week mission that would involve precise maneuvers, including retrofire into lunar orbit, backing down and landing on the Earth, lunar takeoff, mid-course corrections on the way home, and finally, a high-speed re-entry into Earth's atmosphere performed with the precision of so far unknown in vehicle guidance? Not only would all these things have to be done in the short time available, many would have to be worked out at the beginning, during what I have called the Year of Decisions. At the time of Kennedy's announcement, America's first human spaceflight effort, Project Mercury, was already underway. At a press conference in Washington, D.C. on April 9, 1959, NASA introduced the Mercury 7 to the public. The press and public soon adopted them as heroes, embodying the new spirit of space exploration. During the 5-year life of the project, 6 human-tended flights and 8 automated flights were completed, proving that human spaceflight was possible. Once Shepard's flight was successful, Kennedy made his decision, and Mercury focused on initial objectives needed to get to the moon. Project Mercury ballistic capsule. Oof. Attitude controller. Try to install one of them on me and then fucking work, bitch! Astronaut Alan B. Shepard Jr. is rescued by a U.S. Marine helicopter at the termination of a suborbital flight on May 5th, 1961, downrange from the Florida eastern coast. Ooh, here's a whole page about the Mercury missions. Ooh, I think we'll save some of these for another day. Just as Orion and the International Space Station are helping NASA learn how to go further into space for longer missions, the Gemini program defined and tested the skills NASA would need to go to the moon in the 1960s and 70s. Gemini had 4 main goals: to test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration missions, up to 2 weeks in space, to understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in orbit around the Earth and the moon, to perfect re-entry and landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts. This artist's concept of a 2-person Gemini spacecraft in flight shows a cutaway view. Gemini paved the way for Apollo and had 4 main goals, which we just read. So we had Mercury, Gemini, and then Apollo. Alright, the Apollo 11 mission overview, though. This will be good. Hopefully. The eel has landed. Mission objective. The primary objective of Apollo 11 was to complete a national goal set by President John F. Kennedy on May 25, 1961. Perform a crewed lunar landing and return to Earth. Additional flight objectives included scientific exploration by the Lunar Module, or LM, crew, deployment of a television camera to transmit signals to Earth, and deployment of a solar wind composition experiment, seismic experiment package, and a laser-ranging retroreflector. During the exploration, the 2 astronauts were to gather samples of lunar surface materials for return to Earth. They also were to extensively photograph the lunar terrain, the deployed scientific equipment, the LM spacecraft, and each other, both with still and motion picture cameras. This was to be the last Apollo mission to fly a free return trajectory, which would enable a return to Earth with no engine firing, providing a ready abort of the mission at any time prior to lunar orbit insertion. Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy on July 16, 1969, carrying Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin to an initial Earth orbit of 114 by 116 miles. An estimated 650 million people watched Armstrong's televised image and heard his voice describe the event as he took one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind on July 20th, 1969. 2 hours, 44 minutes, and 1.5 revolutions after launch, the SIVB stage reignited for a second burn of 5 minutes, 48 seconds, placing Apollo 11 into a translunar orbit. The Command and Service Module, or CSM, Columbia, separated from the stage, which included the Spacecraft Lunar Module Adapter, or SLA, captivating the Lunar Module, or LM, Eagle. After transposition and jettisoning of the SLA panels on the SIVB stage, CSM docked the LM. The SIVB stage separated and injected into heliocentric orbit 4 hours, 40 minutes into the flight. The first color TV transmission to Earth from Apollo 11 occurred during the translunar coast of the CSM-LM. Later, on July 17th, a 3-second burn of the SPS was made to perform the second of 4 scheduled mid-course corrections programmed for the flight. The launch had been so successful that the other 3 were not needed. On July 18th, Armstrong and Aldrin put on their spacesuits and climbed through the docking tunnel from Columbia to Eagle to check out the LM and to make the second TV transmission. On July 19th, after Apollo 11 had flown behind the Moon out of contact with Earth, came the first lunar orbit insertion maneuver. After about 75 hours, 50 minutes into the flight, a retrograde firing of the SPS for 357.5 seconds placed the spacecraft into an initial elliptical lunar orbit of 69 by 190 miles. Nice. Later, a second burn of the SPS for 17 seconds placed the docked vehicles into a lunar orbit of 62 by 70.5 miles, which was calculated to change the orbit of the CSM piloted by Collins. The change happened because of lunar gravity perturbations to the nominal 69 nice miles required for subsequent LM rendezvous and docking after completion of the lunar landing. Before this second SPS firing, another TV transmission was made, this time from the surface of the Moon. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the LM again, made a final check, and at 100 hours 12 minutes into the flight, the Eagle undocked and separated from Columbia for visual inspection. At 101 hours 36 minutes, when the LM was behind the Moon on its 13th orbit, the LM descent engine fired for 30 seconds to provide retrograde thrust and commenced descent orbit insertion, changing to an orbit of 9 by 67 miles on a trajectory that was virtually identical to that flown by Apollo 10. At 102 hours 33 minutes after Columbia and Eagle had reappeared from behind the Moon, and when the LM was about 300 miles uprange, powered descent initiation was performed with the descent engine firing for 756.3 seconds. After 8 minutes, the LM was at high gate, about 26,000 feet above the surface, and about 5 miles from the landing zone. The descent engine continued to provide braking thrust until about 102 hours, 45 minutes into the mission. Partially piloted manually by Armstrong, the Eagle landed in the Sea of Tranquility in Site 2 at 0 degrees, 41 minutes, 15 seconds north latitude and 23 degrees, 26 minutes east longitude. This was about 4 miles downrange from the predicted touchdown point and occurred almost 1.5 minutes earlier than scheduled. It included a power descent that ran a mere nominal 40 seconds longer than the pre-flight planning due to translation maneuvers to avoid a crater during the final phase of landing. Attached to the descent stage was a commemorative plaque signed by President Richard M. Nixon and the 3 astronauts. The flight plan called for the first EVA to begin after a 4-hour rest period, but it was advanced to begin as soon as possible. Nonetheless, it was almost 4 hours later that Armstrong emerged from the Eagle and deployed the TV camera for the transmission of the event to Earth. At about 109 hours, 42 minutes after launch, Armstrong stepped onto the Moon. About 20 minutes later, Aldrin followed him. The camera was then positioned on a tripod about 30 feet from the LM. Half an hour later, President Nixon spoke by telephone link with the astronauts. "I'm doing alright today. A little tired, as usual, but doing alright. Glad to hear you're doing well." Commemorative medallions bearing the names of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts who lost their lives in a launch pad fire and 2 cosmonauts who also died in accidents were left on the Moon's surface. a 1.5-inch silicone disc containing micro-miniaturized goodwill messages from 73 countries, and the names of congressional and NASA leaders also stayed behind. Left a lot of stuff on the moon. During the EVA, in which they both EVA, in which they both ranged up to 300 feet from the Eagle, Aldrin deployed the early Apollo Scientific Experiments Package, or ESEP, experiments, and Armstrong and Aldrin gathered and verbally reported on the lunar surface samples. After Aldrin had spent 1 hour 33 minutes on the surface, he re-entered the LM, followed 41 minutes later by Armstrong. The entire EVA phase lasted more than 2.5 hours, ending at 111 hours 39 minutes into the mission. Armstrong and Aldrin spent 21 hours 36 minutes on the moon's surface. After a rest period that included 7 hours of sleep, the ascent stage engine fired at 124 hours 22 minutes. It was shut down 435 seconds later when the Eagle reached an initial orbit of 11 by 55 miles above the moon, and when Columbia was on its 25th revolution. At the ascent stage reached Apollon, the point at which a spacecraft in lunar orbit is furthest from the moon.
Apollon.
As the ascent stage reached Apollon at 125 hours, 19 minutes, the Reaction Control System, or RCS, fired so as to nearly circularize the Eagle orbit at about 56 miles, some 13 miles below and slightly behind Columbia. Subsequent firings of the LM RCS changed the orbit to 57 by 72 miles. Docking with Columbia occurred on the CSM's 27th revolution at 128 hours 3 minutes into the mission. Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the CSM with Collins. 4 hours later, the LM jettisoned and remained in lunar orbit. Trans-Earth injection of the CSM began July 21st, as the SPS fired for 2.5 minutes when Columbia was behind the moon on its 59th hour of lunar orbit. Following this, the astronauts slept for about 10 hours. I'll bet, shoot. At 11.2 second firing of the SPS accomplished the only mid-course correction required on the return flight. The correction was made July 22nd at about 150 hours 30 minutes into the mission. 2 more television transmissions were made during the trans-Earth coast. Re-entry procedures were initiated July 24th, 44 hours after leaving lunar orbit. The SM separated from the CM, which was reoriented to a heat shield forward position. Parachute deployment occurred at 195 hours 13 minutes. After a flight of 195 hours 18 minutes 35 seconds, about 36 minutes longer than planned, Apollo 11 splashed down the Pacific Ocean, 13 miles from the recovery ship USS Hornet. Because of bad weather in the target area, the landing point was changed by about 250 miles. Whew. Apollo 11 landed 13 degrees 19 minutes north latitude and 169 degrees minus 9 minutes, 9 minutes west longitude, July 24th, 1969. Let's see, so that's an overview. Oh, we got some images. Nice. Let's look through. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin, lunar module pilot of the first lunar landing mission, poses for a photograph beside the deployed United States flag during an Apollo 11 extravehicular activity on the lunar surface. The lunar module is on the left, and the footprints of the astronauts are clearly visible. It's one of my cookies. The Apollo 11 crew trains for excursion on the Sea of Tranquility. Simulates deploying and using lunar tools on the surface of the moon during a training exercise on April 22nd, 1969. I remember as a kid, one time when we were learning about about astronauts and the space missions and stuff, you know, they would talk about how hard it is to, you know, use the tools in space because you've got those really thick gloves and you know, zero gravity and stuff. So they had us put on like these really thick, massive gloves that like we could barely feel anything. Like He also had tiny little baby hands because we were children. So they had us, you know, trying to like use a screwdriver or like a wrench or something to like just do some basic stuff, and it was hard. Again, we were also tiny children who didn't have the best motor skills yet, but still. It was fun, and that's always stayed in my mind. That looks like a brownie. That looks like a really dry brownie. But on July 20th, 1969, Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on another celestial body. That's not a picture of either of them, but okay. Oh, here's the plaque. Here we go. Aha. This is a little too big, actually. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. Life Detection Systems Branch Chief Vance Oyama operates a specially designed soil distribution system used for dispersing the lunar soil in equal amounts to thousands of petri dishes. Born on August 5th, 1930, Neil Armstrong was a man of many accomplishments, and when he landed on the moon, he walked into history books. There you go. That's a guy. The Apollo 11 command module is hoisted aboard the USS Hornet, the prime recovery vessel used for the historic Apollo 11 lunar landing mission. This image shows the command service module orbiting the moon as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin explored the lunar surface. This photographic illustration compares the size of Apollo 11 landing Site 2 with that of the metropolitan New York City area. That's the Saturn V. Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins talks to Apollo 11 and Artemis 1 launch teams in Firing Room 1 at Kennedy Space Center. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter simulated what Neil Armstrong saw in those final minutes as he guided the lunar module to the surface of the moon. Ah, I love this one. This view of Earth rising above the moon's horizon was taken from the Apollo 11 spacecraft. The lunar terrain pictured is in the area of Smith Sea on the near side. Artist Russ Arrowsmith's version of Apollo was a potent vision of the program, shows in the works he created. Look at all those babies. Baby old men. On July 20th, 1969, humanity stepped foot on another celestial body and into history. They love using that stepped into history line, don't they? On January 9th, 1969, NASA announced the prime crew of the Apollo 11 lunar landing mission. This portrait was taken on January 10th, the day after the announcement of the crew assignment. From left to right, our lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin, Commander Neil Armstrong, and command module pilot Michael Collins. Did Buzz Aldrin pass away recently? I feel like I don't remember. No, he's still kicking. 93 years old, wow. Michael Collins did pass away in 2021 though. I know Neil Armstrong passed away ages ago, right? In 2012. I don't pay attention because I thought it was earlier than that. Huh? Okay. Damn. Aldrin's still kicking though. This photograph. This photograph at the lunar module at Tranquility Base was taken by Neil Armstrong during the Apollo 11 mission from the rim of the Little West crater on the lunar surface. Armstrong's shadow and the shadow of the camera are visible in the foreground. This is the furthest distance from the lunar module traveled by either astronaut while on the moon. Wow. July 20th, 1969. Buzz Aldrin poses for a photograph besides the deployed United States flag during an Apollo 11 extra. Oh, this is back at the start, isn't it? Yes, it is. Okay. New videos too. Ooh. Ooh. We watched this one earlier. Let's see. Do you want to watch all of these? Probably not all of these. I want to watch a few of these though, if that's alright with you. Let's see. Production. All right. Let me turn the chill music down. And this is about as loud as this one's gonna go, so let me turn this one.
11, 10, 9, ignition sequence.
I don't know why this is so quiet. I'm gonna mute myself.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, loud and clear. Our position 1330.
We've got something
About
in
the flight itself, the thing I remember most is the view of planet Earth from a great distance. Tiny, very shiny, blue and white, bright, beautiful, serene, and fragile. You don't get the full flavor of it looking at this, because this has to be processed by film emulsions, which are pretty crude, and then projected. So it doesn't sparkle like the real thing did. It doesn't shine like a little gem as it would be if you could see it unfiltered.
Apollo 11 was about exploration. about taking risks for great rewards
Yeah.
in science and engineering, about setting an ambitious goal before the world, and then finding the political will and the national means to achieve it. Indelibly impressed upon our nation's memory, the voyage of Apollo still seem incredible. We are inspired by the magnitude and teaming efforts of people from all walks of life, from industries big and small, who worked in tandem to attain a long-term goal of magnificent achievement.
It was the ultimate peaceful competition, USA versus USSR. I'll not assert that it was a diversion which prevented a war. Nonetheless, it was a diversion. It was intense, and it did allow to both sides to take the high road with the objectives of science and learning and exploration. Eventually, it provided a mechanism for engendering cooperation between former adversaries. In that sense, among others, it was an exceptional national investment for both sides.
I meant to read stuff like this a little earlier, but y'all don't come here for me to have an organized presentation. What would you do that for? 55 years ago, 1 year before the moon landing. In July 1968, much work still remained to meet the goal President John F. Kennedy set in May 1961 to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. No American astronaut had flown in space since the November 1966 flight of Gemini 12, the delay largely a result of the tragic Apollo 1 fire. Although the Apollo spacecraft had successfully completed several uncrewed spaceflights, the first crewed mission still lay 3 months in the future. The delays in getting the lunar module ready for its first flight caused schedule concerns, but also presented an opportunity for a bold step to send the second crewed Apollo mission, the first crewed flight of the Saturn V, on a trip to orbit the moon. Using an incremental approach, 3 flights later, NASA accomplished President Kennedy's goal. The American human spaceflight program suffered a jarring setback on January 27, 1967, with the deaths of astronauts Virgil I. Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger B. Schaefer on the Apollo 1 fire. The fire and subsequent investigation led to wholesale changes to the spacecraft, such as the use of fireproof materials and redesign of the hatch to make it easy to open. The early Block I spacecraft, such as Apollo 1, would now only be used for uncrewed missions, with crews flying only aboard the more advanced Block II spacecraft. The fire and its aftermath also led to management changes. For example, George M. Low replaced Joseph F. Shea as Apollo spacecraft program manager. The first Apollo mission after the fire, the uncrewed Apollo 4 in November 1967, included the first launch of the Saturn V moon rocket, as well as a 9-hour flight of a Block I command and service module. Apollo 5 in January 1968 conducted the first uncrewed test of the LM, and despite a few anomalies, managers considered it successful enough that they canceled a second uncrewed flight. The music! My god! I knew something was missing. The April 1968 flight of Apollo 6, planned as a near repeat of Apollo 4, encountered several significant anomalies. Exactly. Encountered several significant anomalies such as first stage pogo or severe vibrations, and the failure of the third stage to restart, leading to an alternate mission scenario. Engineers devised a solution to the pogo problem, and managers decided that the third flight of the Saturn V would carry a crew. Apollo 7 astronauts R. Walter Cunningham, Don F. Eisel, and Walter M. Schirra participate in water egress training. Workers stack the Apollo 7 spacecraft on its Saturn IB rocket at Launch Pad 34, and Schirra and Cunningham and Eisel stand outside the spacecraft simulator. Scott freaking settling in with the coffee. Nice. Did you get one of them? Did you get one of them fancy 7-Eleven coffees you were talking about? With all the fixins? No. No. Get the fancy coffee. You deserve it. I got myself some boba yesterday after my doctor's appointment because it needed just a little treat. It was way too much sugar, but it was delicious. As of July 1968, NASA's plan called for 2 crewed Apollo flights in 1968 and up to 5 in 1969 to achieve the first lunar landing to meet President Kennedy's deadline, with each mission incrementally building on the success of the previous ones. The first mission, Apollo 7, would return American astronauts to space following a 23-month hiatus. Planned for October 1968, the crew of Walter M. Schirra, I don't know your name. Don F. Eisel and R. Walter Cunningham would launch atop a Saturn IB rocket. Planned for October 1968, the crew of these dudes would launch atop a Saturn IB rocket and conduct a shakedown flight of the Block 2 CSM in Earth orbit, including testing the Service Propulsion System engine, critical on later lunar missions for getting into and out of lunar orbit. The flight plan remained open-ended, but managers expected to complete a full-duration 11-day mission, ending with a splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean. Preparations for Apollo 7 proceeded well during the summer of 1968. Workers had stacked the 2-stage Saturn IB rocket on Launchpad 34 back in April. In KSC's Manned Spaceflight Operations Building, Schirra Eisel, I'm sorry dude, I should look up how to pronounce your name at this point, because they keep making me read it. Isley! I'm sorry, Don F. Isley. And to everyone else with the last name Isley, for taking that long to look up the pronunciation. In KSC's Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, Schirra, Isley, and Cunningham completed altitude chamber tests of their spacecraft TSM-101 on July 26th, followed by their backups 3 days later. Workers trucked the spacecraft to the launch pad on August 9th for mating with the rocket. Among major milestones, Schirra, Isley, and Cunningham completed water egress training on the Gulf of Mexico on August 5th, in addition to spending time in the spacecraft simulations at KSC and the main spacecraft center, now NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. The original Apollo 8 crew of Russell L. They keep doing this to me. Schweikart, David R. Scott, and James A. McDivitt during training in June 1968. The second flight, targeting a December 1968 launch, would feature the first crewed launch of a Saturn V rocket. The Apollo 8 crew of James A. McDivitt, David R. Scott, and Russell L. Schweikart would conduct the first crewed tests of the LM in the relative safety of low Earth orbit. McDivitt and Schweikart would fly the... Okay, I gotta afford you the same courtesy. Okay. McDivitt and Schweikart would fly the LM on its independent mission, including separating the ascent stage from the descent stage to simulate a takeoff from the moon, while Scott remained in the CSM. After redocking, Schweikart would conduct a spacewalk to practice an external transfer between the two vehicles. Workers completed stacking the Stage 3 Saturn V rocket in KSC's Vehicle Assembly Building on August 14th. The first component of the spacecraft, LM-3, arrived at KSC on June 9th, while CSM-103 arrived on August 12th. Workers began to prepare both spacecraft for flight. I wish we had more pictures of the workers. I had a relative who worked on one or more of the Apollo missions. I just don't remember exactly what he did. The third flight, planned for early 1969 and flown by Frank Borman, Michael Collins, and William A. Anders, would essentially repeat the Apollo 8 mission, but at the end would fire the SPS engine to raise the high point of their orbit 4,600 miles and then simulate a re-entry at lunar return velocity to test the spaceship's heat shield. On July 23rd, Collins underwent surgery for a bone spur in his neck. Oof. And on August 8th, NASA announced that James A. Lovell from the backup crew would take his place. Later missions in 1969 would progress to sending the CSM and LM combination to lunar orbit, leading to the first landing before the end of the year. Construction of the rocket and spacecraft components for these future missions continued at various contractor facilities around the country. Challenges to this plan began to arise in June 1968. Managers' biggest concerns centered around the readiness of LM-3. After its delivery to KSC on June 9th, managers realized the vehicle needed much more than anticipated and would not meet the planned December Apollo 8 launch date. Best estimates put its flight readiness no earlier than February 1969. That kind of delay would jeopardize meeting President Kennedy's fast-approaching deadline. To complicate matters, intelligence reports indicated that the Soviets were close to sending cosmonauts on a trip around the moon, possibly before the end of the year, and also preparing to test a Saturn V class rocket for a moon landing mission. Apollo spacecraft program manager Lowe formulated a plan both audacious and risky. Without a LM, an Earth orbital Apollo 8 mission would simply repeat Apollo 7's and not advance the program very much. By sending the CSM on a mission around the moon, or even to orbit the moon, NASA would gain valuable experience in navigation and communications at lunar distances. To seek management support for his plan, on August 9th, Lowe met with MSC Director Robert R. Gilruth, who supported his proposal. They called in Christopher C. Kraft, Director of Flight Operations, for his opinion. 2 days earlier, Lowe had asked Kraft to assess the feasibility of a lunar orbit mission for Apollo 8, and Kraft deemed it achievable from a ground control and spacecraft computer standpoint. Chief of Flight Crew Operations Donald K. Deke Slayton joined the discussion, and all agreed to seek support for the plan from the directors of KSC and of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, as well as NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. That afternoon, the four flew to Huntsville and met with MSFC Director Werner von Braun, KSC Director Kurt H. Dubus, and HQ Apollo Program Director Samuel C. Phillips. By the end of the meeting, the group identified no insurmountable technical obstacles to the lunar mission plan, with the qualification that the Apollo 7 mission in October concluded successfully. Von Braun had confidence that the Saturn V performed safely, and Dubus believed KSC could support a December launch. Slayton called Borman, who was with Lovell and Anders conducting tests with their spacecraft in Downey, California. He ordered Borman to immediately fly to Houston, where he offered him command of the new circumlunar Apollo 8 mission, which Borman accepted. His crew would swap missions with the McDivotts, who agreed to fly an Earth orbital test of the LM in February 1969, putting that crew's greater experience with the LM to good use. The training challenge fell on Borman's crew, who now just had 4 months to train for a flight around the moon. Oof. On August 14th, representatives from MSC, MSFC, and KSC attended a meeting in Washington with NASA Deputy Administrator Thomas O'Payne and Apollo Program Director Phillips. The senior headquarters officials present, as NASA Administrator James E. Webb and Associate Administrator for Manned Spaceflight George E. Mueller, attended a conference in Vienna. The group discussed Lowe's proposal and agreed on the technical feasibility of accomplishing a circumlunar flight with Apollo 8 in December. During the discussion, Mueller happened to call from Vienna, and when they presented him with the proposal, he was at first reticent, especially since NASA had yet to fly Apollo 7. He requested more information and more time to consider the proposal so he could properly brief Webb. Payne then polled each center director for his overall assessment. Von Braun, who designed the Saturn V rocket, stated that whether it went to the moon or stayed in Earth orbit didn't matter too much. Dubus stated that KSC could support a Saturn V launch in December, as noted above. His team was already processing both the rocket and the spacecraft. Gilruth agreed that the proposal represented a key step in achieving President Kennedy's goal, and emphasized that the mission should not just loop around the moon, but actually enter orbit. Following additional discussions after Webb's return from Vienna, he agreed to the plan, but would not make a formal decision until after a successful Apollo 7 flight in October. NASA kept the lunar orbit plan quiet even as the crews began training for their respective new missions. An announcement on August 19th merely stated that Apollo 8 would not carry an LM, as the agency continued to assess various mission objectives. Ultimately, the plan required President Lyndon B. Johnson's approval. As those discussions took place, work around the country continued to prepare for the first lunar landing, not without some setbacks. On May 8th, astronaut Neil Armstrong ejected just in the nick of time as the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, LLRV, he was piloting went out of control and crashed. Managers suspended flights of the LLRV and its successor, the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, until October 3rd. Astronauts used the LLRV and LLTV to train for the final few hundred feet of the descent to the moon's surface. On May 27th, astronaut James B. Irwin and pilot Gerald P. Gibbons ran a series of altitude tests in Chamber B of the Space Environment Simulation Laboratory at MSC. A test using the LM test article LTA-8 evaluated the pressure integrity of the LM as well as the new spacesuits designed for the Apollo program. The first series of LTA tests supported the lunar orbital flight of LM-3 on Apollo 9, while a second series in October and November supported the LM flight of Apollo 11, the first lunar landing mission. In June, using SESL's Chamber A, astronauts Joseph P. Kerwin, James D. Brand, and Joe H. Engel completed an 8-day thermal vacuum test using the Apollo 2TV-1 spacecraft to certify the vehicle for Apollo 7. A second test in September certified the vehicle for lunar missions. July 3rd marked the final qualification drop test for the Apollo parachute system, a series began 5 years earlier. The test qualified the parachutes for Apollo 7. History records that Apollo 11 accomplished the first human landing on the moon in July 1969. It is remarkable to think that just 1 year earlier, with the agency still recovering from the Apollo 1 fire, NASA had not yet flown any astronauts aboard an Apollo spacecraft. And further, the agency took the bold step to plan for a lunar orbital mission on just its second crewed mission. With a cadence of a crewed Apollo flight every 2 months between October 1968 and July 1969, NASA accomplished President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. This was probably the one I should have read at the start of stream. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. On this 50th anniversary, 4 years ago, of the historic Apollo 11 mission, the National Archives highlights records about NASA and the space program and events and exhibits in Washington, D.C. and at presidential libraries. Which one's pain? What's pain? Everything's pain. But what specifically? Oh, I'm keeping this for later. I know, I love fried pickles. I'm so sad. And fried chicken, just all the fried things. I can't have the fried things. It's tragic. President Nixon in the Apollo program? Ooh, that's more words. Oh, that's so many more words. Wow. I always go back to the moon. The moon's beautiful. You should go see her. No, it's tragic. Local space elves set itself up for disaster by making themselves read, and then just keeps finding more things to read. Why? Why do I do this to myself? Landing a man on the moon. President Nixon, he's not a crook, and the Apollo program. This was before he was not a crook, or probably during the same time. I don't know. Things happened. I wasn't there. Who was president when astronaut Neil Armstrong, that's how words work, first walked on the moon? And who was president during Apollo 17, America's last lunar mission? If you answered President Nixon, you're correct. The artifacts in this activity document the birth of the Apollo program, the triumph of Apollo 11, and what many consider the end of the space race. I'm not that old. Come on, what? Oh, what? This is for, like, school. I'm teaching you guys. I'm a teacher now. Aren't you happy? Aren't you so lucky you get to have me teaching you things that I don't even know? That's how most of my classes went, I think. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy famously urged the nation to look together toward achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Just over 9 years later, American citizens, along with much of the world, watched as Apollo 11 astronaut Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon on July 20th, 1969. How did this dream become reality? Which presidents played a role in its success? What was accomplished in Apollo missions 1 to 10? And what happened after Apollo 11? Follow the document trail. Oh no, wait, what are these? No, this is just a study guide. This isn't quite what we're looking for right now, I think. That probably actually would be useful to look at. I'm reaching the end of my, life. The end of my energy reserves. No, I'm fine, I'm still alive, I'm here. I'm just tired. I'm not that old, oh my god. I am ancient and forever, baby. Okay, oh, nice. Here's just some little briefs about each mission. That'll be nice way to summarize. Apollo 1. Before any Apollo mission flew, NASA dealt with a major tragedy on January 27th, 1967. As the first Apollo crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Schaff were conducting a simulation on the launch pad in Florida, a flash fire broke out in their capsule. In the 100% oxygen atmosphere NASA was then using, the fire spread quickly and killed all three. The disaster called NASA to re-examine all aspects of the program and rework many of the spacecraft systems. That spring, the mission for which the crew had been training was officially named Apollo 1. Apollo 7. The first Apollo mission to get to space was Apollo 7. During the 11-day flight, the crew conducted a number of tests on the spacecraft systems and conducted the first live TV program from an American spacecraft. All three crew members, Wally Schirra, Walt Cunningham, and Don I developed bad head colds during the mission. Despite the discomfort, the astronauts completed their mission objectives, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability needed by humans in space. Apollo 8. The success of earlier flights. Wow. Look at her. The success of earlier flights, problems in the development of the lunar module, and concerns that the Soviet Union might be ready to launch astronauts around the moon led NASA to change the flight plan for the next Saturn V mission. NASA ultimately changed from an unpiloted Earth-orbiting mission to a crewed flight around the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were the first crew to fly atop the powerful Saturn V booster, ultimately spending 20 hours orbiting the moon. On Christmas Eve 1968, the crew gave a memorable reading from the Book of Genesis, and while in orbit, Anders took the iconic Earthrise photo. Whoa, that's a hell of a shot there. Astronaut Russell T. How do we pronounce that? Schwiekert? Lunar module pilot, operates a 70mm Hasselblad camera during his extravehicular activity on the 4th day of the Apollo 9 Earth orbital mission. The Command Service Module and the Lunar Module 3 Spider are docked. This view was taken from the Command Module Gumdrop. That's cute. Schwiekert wearing an extravehicular mobility suit. Emu! That's adorable. Oh no! Now I'm picturing emus running around the moon. Is standing in golden slippers on the lunar module porch. On his back, partially visible, are a portable life support system and an oxygen purge system. With a trip around the moon completed, it was time for NASA to start seriously planning to land astronauts there. The next step was the Apollo 9 mission, the first to carry a lunar module into orbit. Though the mission stayed in Earth orbit, Commander James McDivitt and the lunar module pilot Rusty Schwickert separated the lunar module from the command module and flew independently for 6 hours, testing the lunar module systems. Schwickert conducted a spacewalk on the lunar module's porch to test the spacesuit astronauts would wear on the moon. Apollo 10. The next test of the lunar module was conducted above the moon. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing. The crew tested all aspects of the mission, even showing the initial docking with the lunar module on the first color television transmission from space. Commander Thomas Stafford and lunar module pilot Eugene Cernan flew the lunar module for 8 hours, coming within 10 miles of the lunar surface and passing over the Sea of Tranquility where Apollo 11 would land. Apollo 11? Read all about it. On July 20th, 1969, humans walked on another world for the first time in history, achieving the goal President John F. Kennedy had set in 1961 before Americans had even orbited the Earth. After a landing that included dodging a lunar crater and boulder field just before touchdown, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin explored the area around their lunar landing site for more than 2 hours. They collected soil and rock samples, set up experiments, planted an American flag, and left behind medallions honoring the Apollo 1 crew and a plaque saying, "We came in peace for all mankind." Apollo 12. Astronaut Alan L. Bean, lunar module pilot for the Apollo 12 lunar landing mission, works at the Modular Equipment Stowage Assembly on the Apollo 12 lunar module during the mission's first extravehicular activity. Among the many mission objectives for Apollo 12 was to recover pieces of Surveyor 3, a robotic lander that had been on the moon for more than 2 years. Scientists wanted to study the effects of the lunar environment on the spacecraft. After a pinpoint landing that gave the crew easy access to Surveyor, they also deployed an experiments package that included a seismometer? Maybe I am old. After leaving lunar orbit, they jettisoned the lunar module's ascent stage so it crashed into the surface, providing a controlled experiment to test the seismometers. Apollo 13. This way made this one a Tom Hanks movie, which I don't think I've ever seen all of Apollo 13. I guess that's my homework for the weekend. Apollo 13 has been called a successful failure because the crew never landed on the moon, but they made it home safely after an explosion crippled their ship. A switch and insulation, which should have been modified during an upgrade to one oxygen tank, were damaged during a test of that tank during construction. When the associated heater was turned on during flight, the tank exploded, depleting almost all of the power from the command module and forcing the crew to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert came home safely thanks to the mission control's improvised procedures and their own ability to implement them. Apollo 14. Notable for the return of America's first astronaut, Alan Shepard, to space, Apollo 14 also was probably the smoothest lunar landing to that point. The crew spent more than 9 hours outside the lunar module and set up a number of experiments. Shepard set a new distance record by walking more than 9,000 feet on the lunar surface, holding a handcart to carry their tools and samples. Apollo 15. Get that rover. I love rovers. For the first time ever, humans drove a car on the moon. Hell yeah. The first of the Apollo J missions, designed for longer stays on the moon. The mission carried a lunar rover, which Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin used while they were on the surface for more than 18 hours. They traveled more than 17 miles in the rover, setting up experiments and collecting 170 pounds of samples. Before leaving the lunar surface, Scott conducted an experiment to test Galileo's theory that objects in a vacuum, without air resistance, would fall at the same rate. He dropped a geological hammer and a feather, which hit the ground at the same time, proving Galileo right. You know, maybe that's one thing I would do if I could travel in time. just show Galileo, you were right. we did it. You'd be like, what? That's fucking sick. Oh, there's footage? Fuck yes.
Kim, we copied both solar wind and penetrometer drum in the ETB.
Not quite yet. I haven't put the solar wind in yet, but I will shortly. I want to watch this. I'll have a good picture there.
Check this out.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon.
I love this.
And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about
Fuck
that?
yeah.
It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Nice. Apollo 16. Apollo 16 also took advantage of having a lunar rover, as Commander John Young and lunar module pilot. For real. Anywho, Apollo 16 took advantage of having a lunar rover, as Commander John Young and lunar module pilot Charles Duke drove more than 16 miles over 3 moonwalks, collecting 209 pounds of samples. Problems forced mission controllers to cut the flight short by a day, but the return trip included a spacewalk by command module pilot Ken Mattingly to retrieve film from a camera in the service module. Apollo 17. Look at all those feet prints. The 7th and last manned lunar landing and return mission to Earth. The last Apollo mission featured the most extensive lunar exploration of the program, with 3 moonwalks that each lasted more than 7 hours, while the crew stayed on the moon for more than 3 days. Commander Gene Cernan and lunar module pilot Harrison Schmitt, the first scientist astronaut to reach the moon, collected 243 pounds of material. These supplies, and those from previous missions, continue to reveal more about the moon as new tools and techniques are developed and applied. So humans ain't been to the moon since 1972. It's been a long time, so now we move on. With Artemis missions, NASA will land the first woman and first person of color on the moon, using innovative technologies to explore more of the lunar surface than ever before. We will collaborate with commercial and international partners and establish the first long-term presence on the moon. Then we will use what we learn on and around the moon to take the next giant leap, sending the first astronauts to Mars. Why are we going to the moon? Because going to the moon is sick. We're going back to the moon for scientific discovery, economic benefits, and inspiration for a new generation of explorers, the Artemis generation. While maintaining American leadership in exploration, we will build a global alliance and explore deep space for the benefit of all. Look at the baby in the spacesuit. That's adorable. What will we do without cool rocks? More and more of us are coming out every year. You know we love cool rocks. One of my favorite things to do with my friends is to just sit in a pile of gravel and pick through rocks with each other and be like, ooh, look at this one. Ooh, I keep that one. Ooh, you want this one? Yes. And we just trade little pebbles with each other. Like, I don't know. I just love it. It's such a wonderful activity. Yes! Yes! You got it! Let's see. Are these going to tell me one by one? Nope, I have to click them. Okay. Discovery. With Artemis, we're building on more than 50 years of exploration experience to reignite America's passion for discovery. We need something to help all of these depressed bitches. Economic opportunity. Artemis missions enable a growing lunar economy by fueling new industries, supporting job growth, and furthering the demand for a skilled workforce. Inspiration for a new generation. We will explore more of the moon than ever before with our commercial and international partners. Along the way, we will engage and inspire new audiences. We are the Artemis generation. Why the moon? Why does the moon? How does the moon? Why moon? I don't love the idea of, every time they say things like economic opportunity, I'm like, this is basically just gonna be like a expensive playground for billionaires, huh? Hopefully not. Hopefully it's more than that. We shall see. Our success will change the world. Look at that. How we are going to the moon? That is a great question. That is unfortunately true. Need to make it sound like you're gonna get money out of this somehow for yeah. God, that's depressing. Humans are so cool when we're not dickheads. We will build an Artemis space camp on the surface and the gateway in lunar orbit. These elements will allow our robots and astronauts to explore more and conduct more science than ever before. Science robots. The Orion spacecraft. The NASA spacecraft that will carry astronauts from Earth to lunar orbit and back. I've been reading this book about like early, like very early, like ideas and propositions for spaceflight and space stations and things like that, and you know, a lot of it was like, you know, things like a lot of people were seeing space stations as like a stepping stone to going to the moon. Like you would have a space station that you would be like a waypoint, or you'd have, you know, like a spacecraft ferrying people to and from the space station or the moon. And I mean, I know that's also kind of basically what it does with the ISS, but still, shit like this is just like, I get so excited, and it's so fun sometimes seeing things that, like, seeing something that an artist drew like over 100 years ago to be like, this would be so sick if we do it like this someday. And it's so close to what we're actually doing now, and it's just, ugh. I know I'm not very articulate, but I never am, and I'm tired, and my voice is going out, and I'm just so excited for space. Space Launch Rocket System rocket. The only rocket that can send Orion, astronauts, and cargo to the moon on a single mission. Upon launch, the SLS will be the most powerful rocket in the world. God damn. Exploration ground systems. The structures on the ground necessary to support launch and recovery of returning astronauts. Gateway. The spaceship in lunar orbit where astronauts will transfer between Orion and the lander on regular Artemis missions. Gateway will remain in orbit for more than a decade, providing a place to live and work and supporting long-term science and human exploration on and around the moon. The Human Landing System. Built by American companies, human landing systems are the final mode of transportation that will take scientists from lunar orbit to the surface and back to orbit. The Artemis Base Camp. To give astronauts a place to live and work on the moon, the Artemis Base Camp concept. Someday they're gonna have concerts on the base camp, though. Just saying. Includes a modern lunar cabin, a rover, and a mobile home. All that we build, all that we study, all that we do prepares us to go. Mission patches. That's so cute! Oh my god. Artemis 1 will be an uncrewed flight test of the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft around the moon. Oh, an update just yesterday. First in a series of increasingly complex missions that will enable human exploration of the moon and Mars. Artemis 2's European service modules making fast moves. Nice! The first uncrewed integrated flight test of NASA's Orion spacecraft and Space Launch System rocket. Did they launch it? Because I felt like they were supposed to launch it last year, but something happened. That's a hell of a shot. Artemis 2 will be the first crewed flight test of the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft around the moon. Artemis 3. Planning is underway for a regular cadence of Artemis missions with crew on and around the moon. We go! We are going! We're doing it! At some point. Tip of the A. The tip of the A of Artemis points beyond the moon and signifies that our efforts at the moon are not the conclusion, but rather the preparation for all that lies beyond. The moon is our next destination and a stepping stone for Mars. It is the focus of all Artemis efforts. The crescent shows missions from our audience's perspective. From Earth we go, back to Earth all that we learn and develop will return. This crescent also visualizes Artemis's bow as the source from which all energy and effort is sent. Yeah, I like it. The red trajectory. The trajectory moves from left to right through the crossbar of the A opposite that of Apollo, thus highlighting the distinct differences in our return to the moon. The trajectory is red to symbolize our path to Mars. Okay, so yes, Artemis 1 did end up launching. Okay. All eyes will be on the historic launch complex 39B when the Orion spacecraft and Space Launch System rocket lift off for the first time from NASA's modernized Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So it did launch on November 16th. The mission was for 25 days, 10 hours, and 53 minutes. And it splashed down December 11th. Okay. Okay. This is like kind of a tangent, but like I might, you know, eventually when I reach affiliate, which I'm getting closer. But like subscriber badges that kind of look like a NASA mission badge. Hell yeah. I think that would be super cute. We're gonna do it. By the end of the year, we're both gonna at least reach affiliate. We'll all do it. All of us together. You watching, even if you're not in chat and chatting with us. You want it? You can do it. Yeah, baby. We got this. Oh my god. A PDF? You shouldn't have. A table of contents? Oh baby. Just hit this little download button. We do love PDFs. Oh my god, look at this. It's so sexy. It's so beautiful. I'm gonna read this later. It's wonderful. Follow NASA. Ooh, do I follow SLS? I don't follow SLS. Let me do that. I'm so excited for space and everything, y'all. Space is so cool, you guys. Did you know that? Yeah, you knew that. That's why you're here. I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up too, though. We covered the moon landing and the future projected missions to the moon. Thank you all again for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I had a lot of fun learning about the moon missions. It's been a great time.